The sun scorched the cracked earth of the savannah, turning the horizon into a shimmering mirage. The heat was unbearable, pressing down like a weight on everything it touched. Samuel Reed, a 47-year-old American zoologist, walked alone through the arid plains, his khaki shirt damp with sweat, boots coated in dust. He had spent over a decade in Kenya, yet something about that afternoon unsettled him. The air felt still, unnatural, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Then he saw it, a motionless shape near a shallow, muddy waterhole. His heart sank. It wasn't just an animal. It was a lion, or what was left of one. The creature looked like a ghost of its former self. Ribs jutted through its sagging skin, and its once majestic mane hung in brittle clumps. But what stopped Samuel in his tracks were the lion's eyes, dim, hollow, yet unmistakably aware. It was still alive. Cautiously, Samuel approached. Any other lion would have growled or fled, but not this one. With a tremor running through its weak limbs, the lion let its head fall gently against Samuel's knee, too weak to do anything else. In that moment, something passed between them. Not fear, not dominance. Trust. Raw, undeserved trust. Samuel knelt fully now, his hand slowly resting on the lion's bony skull. He felt a tremor rise from deep within him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The last time he'd seen eyes like that was in a hospital room, watching his father, Harold Dean, take his final breath, proud, stubborn, and silently begging for peace. Samuel had felt helpless then, powerless, and here he was again, staring into another dying being's eyes, once more without a clear answer. But this time, he wouldn't walk away. He couldn't. He opened his pack, pulling out the last of his water and a cloth. Solomon, that's what he would call him later, barely reacted as Samuel soaked the fabric and pressed it gently to the lion's cracked tongue. Bit by bit, drop by drop, the lion accepted the help, as though it were not just water but dignity being restored. The savannah was silent around them, save for the faint buzzing of flies and the quiet rasp of the lion's breathing. Samuel ignored the radio crackling on his belt. Whatever it was, it could wait. Something stirred deep inside him, something old, unspoken. The weight of past failures, of a life dedicated to saving animals but never truly confronting his own wounds. As he sat in the heat, cradling a dying lion's head, Samuel realized this moment was more than just a rescue. It was redemption, a second chance at something he didn't yet understand. And as the lion shifted ever so slightly, a soft flick of its tail, a faint closing of its eyes, Samuel knew this wasn't the end. Not for Solomon, and maybe not for him either. The following morning, the sun rose slow and heavy, as if reluctant to shine on what the previous day had nearly taken. Samuel hadn't slept. He spent the night by Solomon's side, checking his breathing, wiping away flies, whispering words neither of them truly understood but both seemed to need. The lion was still alive, barely, and though he hadn't stood, his eyes tracked Samuel's every move. That alone was enough to keep hope alive. The bond was fragile, delicate like a thread between cliffs, but it was real. Samuel felt it in his chest like a pulse. The hum of a distant engine broke the silence, a sound out of place in the wilderness. Moments later, a dusty land cruiser pulled into view. From the passenger side jumped Tajiri, a 19-year-old Kenyan field assistant, eager, wide-eyed, and full of the energy Samuel had long forgotten in himself. "I came as soon as I heard the radio," Tajiri said breathlessly, eyes widening as he approached the scene. "Is that really a lion?" He stepped closer, then paused. Solomon lifted his head just slightly at the sound of the boy's voice. It was the first movement he had made on his own. Samuel nodded, his voice rough from the night. "He came to me yesterday, collapsed. I couldn't leave him." He didn't add the part about the lion resting his head on his lap, nor the tears he wiped in the dark. Some things were too sacred to speak aloud, at least for now. Tajiri kneeled beside him, inspecting the lion's frail body with quiet reverence. "He's been starving for a long time," the boy said, "but his spirit's still strong. You can see it in his eyes." Samuel looked at him, surprised. The boy saw more than most. That mattered. As Tajiri fetched the 4 fluids and hydration packs from the vehicle, Samuel found himself staring into the empty distance. The wind stirred the dry grass, and with it, a memory returned. His father standing at the edge of their Wyoming ranch, watching an injured elk struggle to move. Harold Dean hadn't said a word that day. He just handed Samuel a rifle and walked away. Samuel never pulled the trigger. He never could. That guilt had followed him for years, buried deep, resurfacing now in the shape of a dying lion who hadn't asked for mercy, but had found it. The two worked in silence, side by side, as the fluids began to drip slowly into Solomon's bloodstream. Tajiri, curious and careful, watched every movement Samuel made. There was admiration in his silence. Not hero worship, but something deeper, trust. The kind that only forms between people who've seen death up close and choose to fight it anyway. Samuel felt it and, for the first time in a long time, didn't push it away. By dusk, Solomon's breathing had steadied. He still couldn't stand, but his gaze was clear now, fixed on Samuel, unwavering. The sun bled into the horizon, casting the land in gold and fire. As darkness settled, Samuel realized something had shifted, not just in Solomon, but in himself. And for reasons he couldn't yet name, he was terrified of what that meant. 3 days later, Solomon was still alive, and that alone felt like a miracle. He hadn't yet stood, but his breathing had strengthened, and he now lifted his head regularly when Samuel or Tajiri approached. His golden eyes were no longer dull. They held something ancient, something watchful. Samuel had begun documenting every step of Solomon's slow recovery in a worn leather notebook. He wrote as though each entry could somehow protect the lion from death, as if giving meaning to each moment might bend fate in their favor. On the 4th morning, just as Samuel was preparing to administer another hydration pack, he heard the sound of another vehicle approaching. It wasn't Tajiri, he was already there, collecting fresh water from a nearby stream. The engine sound was smoother, newer. When the white SUV came into view, Samuel's stomach tightened. He knew that car, and the woman stepping out of it was someone he hadn't seen in nearly 6 years. Diana Whitford. Her presence hit him harder than the African sun ever could. Diana was dressed in clean field gear, her long gray blonde hair pulled back into a tight braid. She carried herself with confidence, but her eyes betrayed surprise the moment they landed on Samuel. Still charging headfirst into danger, "I see," she said, her voice even, but edged. Samuel didn't rise to meet her tone. He simply nodded, then glanced toward Solomon. "He came to me," he said. "I didn't go looking for this." Diana walked slowly toward the lion, her expression shifting from cool detachment to quiet awe. "He shouldn't be alive." Tajiri returned just in time to catch the exchange. He looked between the two adults, sensing the tension but saying nothing. Diana finally crouched near Solomon and examined him closely. "You stabilized him," she said. "That's no small thing." Samuel shrugged. Stubbornness has its uses. The air between them was dense, thick with unfinished conversations. Years ago, they had worked side by side on a rescue project in Uganda. Somewhere along the line, they had become more. But something had broken between them, and neither had ever been brave enough to fix it. That night, the three of them sat by the campfire in uneasy silence. Tajiri asked Diana how long she planned to stay. "Just until I know the lion's stable," she replied. But Samuel saw through it. She was staying because of Solomon, yes, but also because of something unresolved. He felt it in her lingering glances, in the way she avoided talking about the past. He had his own reasons for not asking questions. Some truths were heavier than silence. As the fire crackled, Solomon let out a low, strained sound, somewhere between a breath and a groan. Samuel stood immediately, kneeling beside him, hand on his mane. The lion's eyes met his, sharp and clear. It wasn't pain this time, it was purpose, and Samuel felt a chill crawl down his spine. Solomon was trying to rise. At dawn, the wind shifted. It wasn't strong, but it carried a different scent, cooler, with a promise of rain. Samuel noticed it first, then looked down at Solomon, who had begun to shift his front paws beneath him. The lion's breathing was shallow, but there was tension in his muscles, as if his body was answering a call his mind had already accepted. Samuel knelt beside him, his hand steady on the lion's neck. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "You don't have to prove anything. Not yet." But Solomon wasn't listening. His eyes were sharp now, determined. Tajiri, watching from a few steps back, held his breath. Diana, half awake near the fire, rose silently and joined them. For a moment, none of them spoke. They simply watched as Solomon, inch by inch, pulled his front legs beneath him. His body trembled, ribs visible with every labored breath. Then, in one painful surge, he lifted his chest off the ground. It wasn't much, not even close to standing, but it was enough to bring tears to Samuel's eyes. For a creature that had collapsed in surrender, this was defiance in its purest form. "Did you see that?" Tajiri whispered, voice cracking. Samuel nodded slowly. "He's not giving up." Diana crouched next to him, her eyes fixed on the lion. "Neither are you," she said, not looking at Samuel. He knew what she meant. Saving Solomon wasn't just about conservation, it was about redemption. For all of them, especially him. And for the first time in days, Samuel let the silence linger without needing to fill it. He wasn't running from it anymore. Later that day, as clouds gathered on the horizon, Diana approached Samuel while Tajiri rested. They stood near the tree line, where the view stretched endlessly into the wild. "You never answered my last letter," she said quietly. Samuel didn't turn to face her. "I read it 100 times, he replied. "But I didn't have a good answer." She smiled, but it was tired. Sometimes silence is worse than a bad answer. The distance between them wasn't just emotional. It was built from years of unsaid things. Grief, guilt, fear of being vulnerable again. And now, surrounded by life and death, it was all bubbling back. Suddenly, a low mechanical buzz echoed through the savannah. Samuel turned sharply. In the distance, a drone hovered, small, metallic, curious. Diana swore under her breath. "Someone's watching." Samuel's stomach dropped. Word had likely gotten out. A starving lion being nursed back to life by a lone American in the bush. It was the kind of story the media devoured. And with drones came questions, exposure, opinions, interference. He looked at Solomon, who now rested again, unaware of the world waking up to his presence. For Samuel, this was sacred, but for others, it was already becoming a spectacle. The next morning, they woke to noise, not the sound of nature, but of men, metal, and voices out of place. A convoy of 3 SUVs kicked up clouds of dust as they approached the makeshift camp. Samuel stepped forward instinctively, shielding Solomon from view. His body moved before his thoughts could catch up. Diana stood beside him, arms crossed, her jaw clenched. "It started," she said flatly. Cameras emerged before greetings. Microphones followed. The lion had become a headline. Reporters fanned out across the clearing, some respectful, others aggressive. One man, American by his accent and arrogance, shoved a camera towards Samuel's face. "How did you find him?" he asked. "Are you planning to keep him as a pet?" Samuel didn't answer. He looked back at Solomon, who was lying with his head resting on his paws, his eyes slow to blink but alert. The noise clearly agitated him, and his chest rose with shallow tension. Tajiri stood protectively nearby, uncertain but visibly uncomfortable. "This is wrong," the boy muttered. Samuel finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "This is a rescue, not a circus." But the press didn't care. They had footage now, a weak lion, a determined American, and a dramatic story set against the wild African backdrop. One of the reporters whispered, "It'll go viral by sunset." Samuel's stomach turned. He hadn't done this for attention. In fact, he had come to Africa to escape it, to bury the weight of his father's legacy, the failures he couldn't name, and the silence he shared with Diana. And now it was all being exposed. Later that evening, after the intruders had left, Solomon tried to stand again. The effort was stronger this time. His back legs shook, but he managed to lift his front completely, pushing his weight up for a moment before collapsing softly into the dirt. It wasn't failure, it was fight. Samuel crouched beside him, hand firm on his shoulder. "You're not alone," he whispered. Behind him, Diana watched in silence. In that small moment of progress, something raw flickered between them. Hope, maybe, or memory. They sat by the fire in the aftermath, quiet once again. Diana finally broke it. "What are you going to do when they come back? When the world starts claiming him?" Samuel didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames, seeing not fire, but the day he had walked away from his father's funeral without saying a word. "I don't know," he said, "but I won't let them turn him into a symbol for something he never asked to be." And as the fire cracked and Solomon's steady breath rose into the night air, Samuel felt the press of time closing in. The world now knew about the lion, but what they didn't know was that the man kneeling beside him was the one being saved. 3 days after the news broke, everything changed. Officials from the Kenyan Wildlife Service arrived at the camp, polite but firm. They wore clean uniforms and carried clipboards, but what Samuel saw in their eyes was bureaucracy, not compassion. "We appreciate your efforts, Mr. Reed," the lead officer said, "but this animal is now under government observation." Behind him, 2 more men stood watching Solomon, as if he were an object in a case. Samuel felt his hands clench into fists. They weren't here to help. They were here to take control. Diana stepped in calmly. "He's still recovering. Moving him now could kill him." The officer gave a slow, rehearsed nod. "We'll consult veterinary staff, of course. But if he's to be transferred, it will be to a government facility." Samuel's voice cut through the air. "A cage." The officer didn't deny it. "A controlled environment," he corrected. Samuel looked down at Solomon, who was now managing to sit upright for brief periods. The lion's eyes still followed Samuel everywhere, as if he trusted no one else. Tajiri had heard every word. That night, he pulled Samuel aside. "They'll take him," he whispered, "and they'll never let him go." Samuel didn't respond at first. He was watching Solomon sleep, head resting peacefully for the first time in weeks. "I made him a promise," he said quietly. "He gave me his trust when he couldn't even stand. I'm not going to break that." Tajiri looked nervous. "You'd go against them?" Samuel's voice was steady. "If I have to." Diana approached later, her face unreadable. "If you resist this, you could be deported. You could be banned from working here again." Samuel looked at her, eyes hollow but calm. "Then I'll go out knowing I did the right thing." She stared at him, frustration building behind her careful composure. "You think you're the only one who cares? You're not the only one who's lost something, Samuel." The words hit like a slap, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. He knew she was right. And yet, this wasn't just about emotion. This was about truth. The next morning, before the officials returned, Samuel made a decision. With Tajiri's help, he moved Solomon, carefully, quietly, to a more remote part of the reserve. Not to hide him forever, but to buy time. Time for healing. Time to fight the system without losing what mattered. Tajiri didn't ask why. He simply followed, believing. As they settled Solomon into the shaded brush of a dry riverbed, the lion let out a low rumble. Not fear, not pain. Something else. Something closer to approval. And in that moment, as the first drops of long-awaited rain began to fall on the dust, Samuel knew he had crossed a line. There was no going back now. But maybe, just maybe, he had finally stepped into the man his father once hoped he'd become. The rain didn't last. It passed through the savannah like a ghost, leaving the soil damp and the air heavy. Samuel sat beside Solomon, who now lay tucked in the narrow, shaded bed of the dry river. The lion had improved, not by much, but enough. He could raise himself, drink without help, even shift position. But time was no longer on their side. Samuel knew they would come looking, and when they did, they wouldn't be interested in recovery, only in protocol. He had bought them days, maybe hours. The storm was coming. By mid-morning, he heard the first signs. A low hum, the growl of engines, too familiar to be anything but official. Tajiri came running, breath short. "They're at the old camp," he said. "They know you moved him." Samuel didn't react with panic. Instead, he looked at Solomon, who was awake, alert, and watching him. "We stay calm," Samuel said. "We do what we can, and we protect him until the very end." His voice was steady, but his hands trembled. Not from fear, from the weight of everything unresolved pressing on his chest. Diana found them hours later. She had followed the tracks on foot, alone. When she appeared through the tall grass, Solomon lifted his head but didn't growl. He recognized her. That meant something. She stopped a few feet away, eyes locked on Samuel. "They're furious," she said. "They're calling it obstruction of government orders." Samuel looked up, dry smile on his face. "That's one way to describe compassion." Diana stepped closer. "They could charge you. Tajiri too. You need to think clearly now." Samuel rose slowly. "I've never thought clearer." She didn't argue. Instead, she handed him a folded piece of paper. "This was found in your old tent. I think you were meant to have it." It was a letter, old, yellowed, but unmistakably written in the sharp, blocky handwriting of Harold Dean, Samuel's late father. Samuel unfolded it with shaking fingers. The letter was dated 3 weeks before his death. In it, Harold wrote of regret, not for war or wounds, but for never learning how to love freely. "You were always better with animals than people," the letter read. "I just didn't know how to say I was proud." Samuel read the letter twice, then a third time. Each line tore something open and stitched something new. He had waited his whole life for those words. And now, on the edge of everything falling apart, they found him. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket, heart pounding. There were things left to say, to Solomon, to Tajiri, maybe even to Diana, but now he could say them with honesty. As the sun dropped low and the engines drew nearer, Samuel turned to Solomon and whispered, "You've come this far. You stood once. You'll stand again." And deep in the lion's throat, there was an answering growl, low, alive, and ready. The convoy arrived just before dusk. Dust billowed up from the red earth as 2 black government trucks and 1 marked wildlife transport vehicle rolled to a halt near the edge of the dry riverbed. Samuel, standing beside Solomon, didn't flinch. His body was still, but his heart pounded like war drums. Tajiri stood a few feet behind him, tense and pale. In front of them, the silhouettes of 5 officers stepped out of the vehicles. The same man from earlier among them, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning, cold. The officer didn't speak at first. He approached slowly, glancing at Solomon, then at the lion's position. Semi-upright, alert, very much alive. "You moved him," the officer said, "against direct instruction." Samuel didn't deny it. "I did, because if I hadn't, he wouldn't be alive for you to see." The officer's eyes narrowed. "This isn't about feelings, Mr. Reed. It's about law." Samuel stepped forward, lowering his voice. "No, it's about responsibility. This lion trusted me. He chose me, and I won't let that be broken." Behind the officer, 2 men began unloading a portable stretcher and tranquilizer equipment. Samuel moved instinctively, placing himself between them and Solomon. Diana, who had followed the convoy in a separate vehicle, quickly stepped between the men. "If you sedate him now in this condition, it could kill him," she warned. "He's still weak. His system might not recover." The officer hesitated. For the first time, he wasn't so sure. The tension hung in the air like the thick weight before a storm. And then, it happened. Solomon rose, slowly, shakily, but completely. First his front legs, then his hind legs groaning under the pressure. His body swayed, muscles trembling, but he stood. Everyone froze. The officers, Tajiri, Diana, even Samuel held his breath. It was more than movement. It was a message, a declaration. Solomon turned his head slightly, looking directly at Samuel, and then at the men behind him. His eyes were calm, fierce, unbroken. The lion wasn't pleading. He was warning. For several seconds, no one moved. The officer took a slow step back. "That animal should be dead," he said almost to himself. Diana crossed her arms. "But he's not, because someone believed in him." The officer seemed conflicted, protocol clashing with something human. He signaled to his men, "Stand down, for now." They retreated, slowly, uncertain. Samuel let out a shaky breath, then placed his hand on Solomon's mane. The lion didn't flinch. He stood steady, and in that surreal, hushed moment, as the sun dipped behind the hills and cast the earth in amber light, a line had been drawn, not by law but by loyalty. A man had stood for a lion, and the lion had stood for himself. By the next morning, the footage had gone viral. One of the officers had filmed Solomon standing, and the clip leaked to the press within hours. The image of a starving lion rising beside a weathered American scientist under the African sun hit every news outlet. They called it the Stand of the Broken King. Samuel's name was everywhere, headlines, interviews, op-eds. But the man at the center of the storm wasn't celebrating. He sat quietly beside Solomon, who now lay resting beneath the acacia trees, stronger, breathing deeper, but still watching the world with wary eyes. Tajiri scrolled through his phone with wide eyes. "They're calling you a hero," he said. "People want to donate. Build a sanctuary. They're offering interviews. You're trending in 5 countries." Samuel didn't look up. "They're not interested in Solomon. Not really. Just the story." Tajiri hesitated. "Maybe, but maybe the story can protect him now. Maybe it's not just noise." Samuel knew the boy meant well, but he also knew how quickly public love turned to apathy or worse, to control. He had seen it happen before. Diana had been fielding calls for hours. Offers from NGOs, wildlife organizations, even government officials from other countries. Some wanted to fund a protected reserve around Solomon. Others wanted to move him to a high-tech enclosure for safety and research. Samuel stood at the edge of the camp as she approached him. "You need to decide," she said, "because they will. If you don't choose where he goes, someone else will." He looked at her, eyes heavy. "I don't want to put him in a cage. Not after all this." He stood up. "I won't be the one to take his freedom." Diana stepped closer. "Then fight for him, but not alone." There was a pause between them, the kind of pause that carries years. Samuel exhaled slowly. "I never meant for this to become a movement." Diana gave a faint smile. "Movements don't ask for permission. They happen when something true refuses to die." And maybe that was what Solomon had become. Not a symbol made by man, but a living truth that refused to fade, even when everything said he should. That night, Samuel sat beside Solomon and opened his father's letter again. He read the last line aloud. "If you ever find something worth protecting, don't walk away from it, even if it costs you everything." The words landed differently now. They weren't about war or guilt or even redemption. They were about love, the quiet kind, the hard kind, the kind that stands when it would be easier to fall. And just before sleep took him, Samuel looked up at the stars and whispered, "You stood once, old friend. Tomorrow, we stand together again." The day of the hearing arrived like a quiet storm. Beneath a white canvas tent set up at the edge of the reserve, representatives from the Wildlife Service, conservation groups, journalists, and local elders gathered to determine Solomon's fate. Samuel stood before them, not as a scientist or a hero, just a man who had once knelt beside a dying lion. Behind him, Tajiri and Diana watched in silence, their presence steady, grounding. Solomon remained nearby under the trees, calm but observant, as if sensing what this moment meant. Panelist cleared her throat. "Mr. Reed, the world has taken notice, but viral videos don't decide conservation policy. What do you propose for this animal?" Samuel stepped forward. "I'm not asking for him to be kept as a relic or a trophy. I'm asking for space, for land where he can exist as he is, not behind glass, not drugged for study. He's alive today because he was free to choose to fight. Let's honor that choice." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded. Others looked unconvinced. Then Tajiri stepped forward, voice trembling but strong. "He's not just a lion to us. He's hope. For every creature that's been thrown away. For every voice that's gone unheard." His words hung in the still air, heavier than any speech. Diana followed with data, proposed plans for an open-range micro-reserve, overseen jointly by local conservationists and wildlife authorities. For the first time, the conversation turned from bureaucracy to possibility. By sundown, the verdict was clear. Solomon would stay. A protected zone would be established, small but free of bars. No cages, no labs, just land, water, and the dignity of survival. Samuel didn't smile when they told him. He just nodded and turned to look at Solomon, who had risen to his feet without prompting, as if sensing the decision had been made. The lion's amber eyes met his. No roar, no sound, just understanding. In the weeks that followed, donations poured in. A foundation was created, not in Samuel's name, but in Solomon's. Samuel declined interviews, preferring to work quietly, building shelters, setting markers, tracking migration. He and Diana rebuilt their rhythm, slowly, respectfully, perhaps for the last time. And Tajiri, now confident and growing into a leader, took on the daily care of the land, telling Solomon's story not as legend, but as truth. One evening, long after the headlines had faded, Samuel sat alone near the riverbed where it had all begun. Solomon lay nearby, half asleep, tail twitching in the dusk. Samuel whispered, "You gave me more than I ever gave you." He looked up at the stars, remembering his father's final words, and smiled, not because the pain had gone, but because he finally knew what to do with it. And in the stillness of that African night, one man and one lion rested side by side, both having stood and never fallen again.